Thank you for joining us tonight. Give us just a second to get everyone in from the waiting room and we will begin. Okay, just a couple more people trickling in. Okay, go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Caitlin Wilson, and I am the Assistant Director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. We hope you all are well and safe, and we thank you for joining us virtually tonight for this very important discussion. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know we will be recording this panel, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel later this week. We also ask that all participants stay on mute with their camera off for the duration of the panel. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so using the chat function on Zoom. Now I would like to turn it over to Merrill College PhD student and helper in the Povich Center, Kate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual panel. We're happy to have you here. So as Caitlin said, I'm Kate Yanchulis, PhD student at the College of Journalism, and I do a lot of sports journalism research. Tonight, we learn more about one of the most important sports stories of the year, allegations of sexual harassment over many years within the Washington Football Organization. Starting with an in-depth article published July 16th, the Washington Post has reported the story exhaustively, and the Post continues to break news. We're pleased to have with us the Post reporters who have broken these stories, Liz Clarke and Will Hobson, and one of the primary editors on the series, Matt Rennie. Tonight's format is we'll begin with a discussion for 35 to 40 minutes. Then there will be time for questions from the audience. Submit your questions in the chat box at any time during the discussion, and we'll circle back to them. It's Povich Center policy to reserve the first two questions of the night for Merrill College students. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Mark Hyman, the director of the Povich Center, but first I'll turn it over to the Dean of the College of Journalism, Lucy Dalglish.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Philip Merrill College of Journalism and the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. We're so thrilled to have you here. I hope you're all doing well. School has started, and there's no better symbol of that than the Povich Center is now up and running. We're having a very wonderful conversation. I'm so thrilled that the first one of our 2021 school year is on a subject that is so important to all of us. You may recall that last year we had a search to replace George Solomon, who had been our Povich Center Executive Director for many, many years. And thanks to a fund drive and a gift from the Povich family and from many of you, we created the George Solomon Chair in Sports Journalism. We had a national search to replace or to find the next Povich Center Director. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce to you the new Povich Center Director, Mark Hyman, who comes to us after teaching for 6 or 8 years at George Washington University. He has lots of ideas, he has lots of energy, and we're very, very excited that he was willing to come over to the University of Maryland. And I will turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Lucy. I appreciate that welcome. I also want to welcome Liz, Will, and Matt, and I'd like to welcome them back to Zoom, because I understand that Zoom has kind of been a second home for Liz and Will and Matt and the Post team working on this project. I wonder, have you guys met in person since this project began? Will,
yeah.
Tell us.
I had a false positive test for COVID, and Matt was kind enough to, and then that same week, our AC unit went out of our house, and Matt was kind enough to drop off a wall unit. So that is the only time I've seen Matt in person. We were 6 feet apart. But yeah.
So all of the work has been done virtually.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that and the challenges of working in that environment on a story as complex and important as this one. But tonight, I'd like to talk about the substance and the reporting of this important series of stories. The substance, of course, being the accounts of 40 women who worked for the Washington football team, and their stories of sexual harassment, some dating back to the early 2000s. And then the reporting, which, to me is fascinating. The challenge and the perseverance and the human touch needed to persuade those women that they should talk to the Post and that they should tell their stories to the public. So I thought that to organize our conversation, we might start in the present or the near present and kind of work backwards. And start with, I think, a very important date in this timeline, August 31st, when Liz wrote a piece for the Post reporting on the fact that the NFL had assumed oversight of the investigation of the Washington football team. And let's begin with Liz. Liz, what's the significance of that development, and what are the possible outcomes?
Sure. Well, on behalf of all of us, thanks for having this program, including us all. And there isn't one story that wasn't a collective effort. So that story as well involved great editors' guidance, Matt Rennie chief among them, and Will's contribution. And we have another coworker who has joined us for this second push, Beth Reinhardt, who's not with us tonight. So everything is a collective effort, and it really needs to be. We've needed each and every brain, heart and patience and poise, and it's a collective. So the significance, I would say, of the NFL taking the reins of what to that point had ostensibly been an outside investigation, but that outside investigation was initiated by the team owner, Dan Snyder, after the first story that reported 15 female former employees had reported or told us about instances of harassment. So that initial response was Dan Snyder selected a very accomplished Washington-based lawyer to do an investigation and report to him the findings. So the significance of the date you identified, it's a couple things. The NFL saying, we really are going to be in charge of this. Now, I must say, Dan Snyder has said that this was really his decision, that he asked the NFL to take it on, to take it over. But one thing that we'll get into, I'm quite sure, as we talk about the challenge of reporting this, is non-disclosure agreements. The legal agreement that virtually every team employee had to sign. Way back in the day, you'd sign it when you quit or were fired or left the team. And it's a legal binding agreement that you will not either speak about your time at the team to anyone. And more recently, those documents are signed upon your hiring. So they affect everyone. And that is among several very serious barriers to talking to a source, to getting someone to tell you about their experience. Because they're saddled with this legal agreement. Many of these people are quite young. They can't afford to litigate this, it's a very powerful document. So if 1A of that story was the NFL is taking over the investigation, meaning Beth Wilkinson, who is the lawyer leading it, she will report to the league. 1B of that story is that strictly for the purposes of telling your story to Beth Wilkinson, all former employees were absolved of their NDA. The NDA would be lifted. In a sense, that doesn't mean it helps the Washington Post, but the important thing is that they can tell their stories to an impartial source, and then the league can decide what, if anything, to do about it. So that I hope that sums up the significance of that story.
Yeah, maybe Will can weigh in on the second part of the question with respect to the possible outcomes of this investigation. When might we hear, if ever, will we ever know what the results are? And if we do, what are the possible, findings, do you think?
Right. So those are actually questions we're trying to report out right now. I think on the timeline thing, I'd say months. I mean, typically investigations of this nature take at least a few months. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's not done in this calendar year. Where the report goes that Beth Wilkinson will write, presumably, summarizing her findings, whether that will be published or not, that is an unanswered question. We haven't gotten that question answered yet from the league or from the Wilkinson firm. In previous situations, I know, I'm pretty sure there was an investigation, a league overseen investigation of former Carolina Panthers owner Jerry Richardson, in which they didn't release the full report, but they did put out like a press release that basically had a summary of the main findings. And then as it relates to, punishments and penalties, I think anything ranging from, a fine to, potentially if they find grave enough conduct that was overseen or, the responsibility of Dan Snyder, there's, the possibility of talking about the league forcing him to sell the team. But that, that's something that I'm not sure there is a precedent for.
Okay. Well, now let's go all the way back to the beginning and talk about kind of the early days of your reporting on this story. The first story, of course, appeared on July 16 and was a bombshell. Just an amazing piece of reporting and got an awful lot of attention. When did you, as a team, let's hear from Matt on this. What's the first day you can remember working on this project?
Oh gosh, I mean, some of this reporting goes back a long way. I mean, this has obviously always been a significant, the football team is a significant institution to the city, to the community. And really, if you cover sports on a national basis, all 32 NFL teams are. But this has been a tumultuous summer for this particular team because of all the things that have been out there. So, I mean, really, we were paying careful attention to the team starting in late June when the team nickname kind of came to the fore. That issue came to the forefront once again. It's been in the forefront a lot. Off and on over the 21 years I've worked here. And Liz was actually was instrumental in that story and wrote the story. It was going into 4th of July weekend, I remember. It was days before July 1st or 2nd or something like that, when she wrote a story that involved FedEx saying that they were threatening to withdraw their sponsorship to the team if the nickname continued. And so starting then, really, we were more interested in what was going on with the team and ownership and everything else from that time forward. So we just kind of raised our level of scrutiny and talked to different people involved, and that's how we sort of started to come upon some of these reports. And I think, people might have been more forthcoming than they had been in the past, just because there was so much going on with it. It's hard to know exactly why. I mean, this has obviously been a very unusual summer in the country for everyone. So for whatever reason, people were telling us things that some of which we'd kind of heard before, but were never able to substantiate. Some things were brand new.
Liz, can you put your finger on a day when you began working on this?
Sure, and I know Will needs to join me when I get to the point, because the roots of this story really go back 2 years, the summer of 2018. If your students I don't know to the extent they were aware, but that summer, that spring of 2018, the New York Times actually had quite a powerful story, an expose about the Washington NFL team using their cheerleaders, specifically the annual calendar shoots that are always held at a tropical location to get the atmosphere, and they're very scantily clad and take these photos for the calendar. The team had begun using trips for their very high-end customer suite holders as a sales incentive, you know, that you could come as a fan and watch this. And so it really kind of blurred the line of exploitation of what's appropriate. And anyway, that at the time was quite a shocking story. So to bring that back to the Post, we started then doing some reporting on the broader issue of how women in general are treated, as well as some other facets of the team. Will, I, and a third reporter worked very, very hard trying to get current and former female employees to talk about some of the issues that we ended up reporting this summer. But because of the fear, because of the non-disclosure agreements, and just the climate for speaking out on whatever you feel strongly about in our country, 2 years ago, it wasn't quite where it is now. We didn't give up on the project, but we just set it aside. We never got what we thought was the essence of a story. So it was around the time that Matt Rennie referred to this June when you get the feeling that the name issue has traction and other issues. Very soon after that, we learned that 3 of the co-owners are trying to sell their interest in the team. So there are some growing senses of kind of foundational cracks in this franchise that has dominated this market for 80 years, or if not more. And Will had sort of the good instinct among us all to revisit the issue of how women were treated. So he picked up where he paused and kind of led us along. But Will, you help me here.
No, yeah, no, that's a great summary. And I think what happened was basically, you know, Emily Applegate, the one woman on the record in the first story, she had told me in 2018 that she considered going on the record, but we didn't have anyone else even on background giving us really strong enough material to hang that story just around Emily at that point. And then I think what happened was there was a popular executive by the name of Brian Lefamina, and we get into this in the second story. There were a lot of young employees who thought he was going to turn the culture around. Dan fired him, and there was a mass exodus. So a lot of the women who were in the summer of 2018 telling Liz and I won't talk to you, or weren't even returning our calls, all of a sudden, when we started calling them this summer, we're taking those calls. And then there was kind of a recent crescendo where they were passing our numbers around to each other, and we were just starting to get unsolicited phone calls. I hear you guys are looking into how women are treated at the Redskins. You know, you got to know about this.
So there was some threshold that you crossed this summer that you were unable to cross in 2018. Is that fair?
Yes.
100%.
Can you be very specific about that? Was it the number of women who were talking to you, or the seriousness of the allegations, or something else?
I mean, it was both. It was the number of the women who were agreeing, even on background, to let us use their stories. And then, you know, we started going to the team with some of these allegations, and then they honestly kind of forced our hand. We probably wouldn't have written and published as soon as we had, but they started firing everyone we were looking into. So, and then that created this unusual situation where there was a lot of speculation about what we were writing about. So yeah, there was that first weekend before the first story, they in short order fired two scouts, and then the Tuesday or Wednesday after, Larry Michael, the longtime broadcaster, abruptly retired. And at that point, you know, the stuff that we had the allegations about them had reached a critical mass that we felt we were okay to publish.
And if I could tack on to that about, you know, the benchmarks or what really you're specifically changed this summer as opposed to 2 years ago. That cohort that left the team after January 2019, when Brian Lafamina was fired. It was a young cohort of about 40 employees, both male and female, who that management decision was very shattering for these young people, many of whom had started at the team as interns. This was their first job. They had been, particularly the women, really marginalized, you know, received so many sexist comments, so many things that are inappropriate. And they told us, so many of them in their own words, again, not as a concerted message, but independently, I kept hearing stories of, this was my first professional job. I thought that's how the workplace was, or I thought that was the price of admission for a career in sports. If you're a woman, you had to get, you know, unwelcome comments and people looking up your skirt and down your shirt and commenting on your body, that they just thought that was normal. So happily for many of these very smart young men and women, they got a second job. They might have gotten a third job. And so now they have the perspective in their mid-20s and 30s, like, no, the workplace isn't like this. I'm a woman, I have every right to walk where I choose, you know, weigh in, sit in on this meeting, do this. It sounds very elemental, but there was an awakening for a lot of these people, young people. And I think quite so, you know, one could write a thesis on where our country is this summer in the wake of the George Floyd killing and so many killings. We see young people in high school, at the college level, in all walks of life, more emboldened to speak and speak out for what's right. And in their world, where we were looking, they wanted some attention paid to this, even if they couldn't be on the record and let us use their name. They wanted to be one of the 14 or 15 who were unnamed.
Liz, that's a good segue to my next question about that first story, in which, as Will mentioned, Emily Applegate, former employee of the team, is the only one of the 15 women who are making allegations who is identified by name. And I'd be very interested in hearing more about the conversations that were going on with those other 14 women with respect to whether they could be named and what their thinking was. And as a reporter, how much do you push and encourage women in that position to be named in a story?
I love that question, and that issue tortured me, and it's one that we spoke about. I feel like I'm being a hog for talking, so I'll have things to say, but Will, Matt, you want to address also?
I mean, you are probably the people that are best positioned to address that, because you have the direct contact with the people themselves. But you know, in fact, you could speak about different feelings and different techniques. Everyone's a different individual on that. I would just say, as an editor, you just have full trust in your reporters on a story like this. You kind of have to, even if, you know, knowing that there'll be different approaches and different techniques. But if you believe in the importance of the story, that's, you know, you also know that you need that. And you know, at some level, that people are talking to you because they want the story to be told. So.
Well, good.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd say to that is just, you know, that you know, there's a strength in numbers component to it. And, you know, for the first story, we were a little, I think, lucky in that the team didn't deny a whole lot. They very quickly fired the people we were writing about and then hired an outside investigator. So I think the calculus on that first story would have been a little bit different if there were these firm denials and then we just had one woman on the record and 14 on background. And then for the second story we did have a much more sizable number of women willing to, put their names next to the allegations they were making.
Mm-hmm. But to the heart of your question, Mark, about how much do you push? And I really think that's the ethical issue and in some ways the strategic issue. I mean, I want to always lead with my heart and with compassion and understanding about the situation the person is in, who I'm talking to. What are their vulnerabilities? What are their fears? But there's also just no gain in browbeating somebody. I mean, that's just stupid reporting. But, most importantly, I go back to the NDAs. If I was starting a conversation with a former employee, female employee who had a story she wanted the world to know, she wanted to tell me, but she said, I can't be quoted by name because I signed an NDA. It is not my place to tell her, oh, don't worry about that. You never get sued over that. Nor is it my place to say, well, here's a lawyer you can call and ask them for advice. You just have to respect that's a big burden on them. I mean, and explain, here's why your story has value, because I think you know as well as I do, you are not alone. You are one of 20, you are one of 40, God knows how many you are. And just kind of give the person space to breathe and reflect. They might want to talk to their parents. We learned later there was a online support group that formed of, more than a dozen former female employees across the country who would go online and, are you talking? Did you get a call from the Post? What do you think? So they're trying to help each other. But no, there's not pushing of someone who is in a legal bind in my book. But you want to give them space and not everybody had the NDA. There are certainly people who hadn't signed NDAs for one reason or another, but they said, I am petrified of Dan Snyder. I am petrified of being sued. He will come after me. And again, it's not my place to minimize that. It's my place to listen to it and help them, listen as they weigh different things and hope that they'll want to talk to us. So yeah, I'm not big on leaning on a person, especially when they've already been violated. Like, lean on me to tell your story of pain and abuse. I want them to see journalism, or they're telling their story, as constructive, cathartic, a safe haven for them, something good for them. And I think for many women, it has been that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think a great teaching moment for students who wonder, where is that line and how do I show compassion, but also do my job and try to, present the most complete picture in a story. So that's great. Thank you.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, Mark, is just that, and it's not a counterpoint to that at all, because I think that's what the qualities Liz and Will embody in their work are admirable, but that the other side of it is, we don't print stories with publish stories with unnamed, accusations and unattributed accusations, and that's part of the reason why a lot of this material has been tabled for 2 years, because people wouldn't put their name to it. Yeah. And so there is a balance there that you hope you can approach in a respectful way, but, also to reflect to people, if I assume we're talking because you want this story to be told, and the only way to do it in a credible, responsible way is sometimes to have some people put their names to it.
I'm so glad Matt spoke to that, and I don't want to leave the impression that it's just like open mic night. If you have a story you want to tell and can't use your name, have at it. Anything that we reported that we were unable to use the name, we vetted. We did a lot of reporting under the surface, spoke to contemporaneous people who could verify that these things were real. We looked at documents, we looked at emails, so right. There was tremendous reporting below the surface of what might seem simple.
So one of the, I think, fascinating parts of this story is that you were, the subjects of your stories included journalists. You were interviewing journalists about experiences that they had had covering the Redskins. And I'm hoping that you'll speak to us about that. Number one, interviewing, colleagues about, things that had happened to them. And I also wonder about, you're working on an enterprise story and you're sharing basically what you're doing with someone who works for another news organization while you're interviewing them. They know that you're working on this story. So it's very kind of complicated. And I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, so both those interviews, that was a conversation we had with strategically, when were we going to approach, it was Rhiannon Walker, the reporter for the Athletic, we'd heard this allegation that she had been harassed at a public event by Alex Santos, the pro personnel director for the team. And yeah, it was, we wanted to talk to Rhiannon about that, but there was legitimate concern that, it's another media outlet. Would Rhiannon then, would the Athletic want to then publish maybe a first person story of hers? But Rhiannon was very interested to talk to us and very happy to talk on the record. The Athletic was very interested in getting a statement in there to indicate that they, as her employer, took this very seriously, which provided a good degree of corroboration for us. And then Rhiannon pointed us to Nora Princiati, a reporter for The Ringer, who had a very similar experience. And so, yeah, both those conversations took place in decent proximity to when we actually published. So there wasn't a tremendous level of competitiveness.
Liz, I can't let this opportunity pass. I mean, you covered the team for 8 years.
Yes. Yes.
Did you witness any of this, or did you experience it yourself?
Well, yes. In one case, sure. I had an unwelcome series of comments from one person, but if it's not obvious, I should, I'm clearly, I've done this a long time, and I'm a generation older than both of the female reporters who had these unwelcome overtures and in one case reported and acknowledged. So I'm from a different era, proudly so. And so I think this is my 30th year as a sports writer, and maybe 35th as a reporter. So I just have always had my own kind of ethos or way of dealing with unwelcome overtures, including when I covered the North Carolina legislature as a young female reporter. There were plenty of unwelcome, grossly age inappropriate comments made. So, over the decades, I just have developed a way, particularly in this context of this team, of just saying to the person who I knew and covered, like, cut it out. I don't know your mother, but I'm probably her age, so don't creep me out. Back off, or back the F off, with a smile. And so, that's just me. That's who I am. That is how I have come to make my space, claim my turf. I'm not in any way saying this is the way you should handle it. I think young women today, whether reporters or young employees of an NFL team, have every right to go to HR, to report someone, to just call that person out and say, that's not acceptable. You don't speak to me that way. I was more, I'll handle myself. I didn't go to the team, nor my bosses. But that's kind of an old school, and I know a lot of women my age, that's their approach, to just get in their face too.
So I'm going to have to yield to the many people in the room who have questions for you soon. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of pivot to the big picture here and the importance you think that this story may have going forward. The issues that we're talking about, do you think that they're pervasive in the NFL and in among pro sports organizations? And do you think that's likely to change in part because of what you've done?
Liz?
Me? I know a good number of women who cover NFL teams and who once worked for this particular one in Washington and have gone on to other NFL teams. And what we came across is not typical. It's not normal. It's clearly not acceptable. I'm quite sure there are variations of it, but I would not paint a broad brush that this is what it's like for young women to work for an NFL team. In fact, I know that's not the case, nor NBA or Major League Baseball. I just don't think you can extrapolate. I mean, being a female sports writer, I work in a male-dominated workplace as well. One of the young women who did file a complaint with this team was told by a team executive, look, this is a male-dominated workplace. You can get used to it or quit. You know, the notion that I would be told that as a Washington Post employee, or that any professional organization would tell that to a female employee in 2020 is preposterous to me. I cannot believe that. So no, I don't think this is par for the course. I certainly hope that things improve, the working conditions improve, the culture improves at this particular team, and they've taken steps and made some hires that indicate that is their intent, and there is, we should all give that a chance to unfold, and keep an eye on it and see if it does unfold. You know, do they hire an experienced, capable HR person? And they've made some good hires so far, and as Will said, gotten rid of some people who were abusive to other employees. So I'll stop there, and one of you guys take the next, or the other piece of that, which
No,
is like,
I'll just echo what Liz said, is that, I don't, and I yield Liz on that because I haven't covered an NFL team for an extended period of time, or the league at large. And I spoke to a number of women who went on to work for other professional sports franchises who said, look, I mean, women deal with unwelcome overtures in all walks of life. But this can be an issue in professional sports, but it was particularly acute at that team. And yeah, I mean, things like what Liz described, just being explicitly told that these types of overtures are just a fact of life here. I don't think that is a pervasive. I hope and don't have any reporting to indicate that that's pervasive across the NFL.
Where does the story go from here? Are you actively pursuing and receiving leads and thinking about another major story, or what's the approach going forward?
I mean, we're certainly continuing to follow any tips or leads that come into our inboxes or that we hear from folks we're talking to. There is this NFL investigation that we have to follow in terms of what they find, and then there's a dispute between the ownership right now, and that we need to keep track of that. So we'll see.
Okay, that was great. And now I think it's time for me to turn things over to the Assistant Director of the Povich Center, Caitlin Wilson, who is curating questions from the very large audience for this event. So Caitlin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Mark. So our first question comes from PhD student Kate. With such a long-lasting and far-reaching investigation, how do you decide when you have enough to publish?
Sounds like an editor's question.
Well, Will spoke to this a little bit earlier. The first story, I gotta say, was a pretty unprecedented experience in that regard for us. So, you know, it's hard to even put my head back into that time. It was, even though it wasn't that long ago, but it was, you know, we thought we were getting close to, we know we were getting close to a publication threshold because we had gone to the team with specific allegations that we were seeking answers about. And then the response was unusual in that people, as Will spoke to, people got fired before. I mean, I think I said to Will that week, I said, this is the most bizarre experience I've ever had. You haven't even filed a word of the story yet, and 2 people have gotten fired. And so it was, and that generated a lot of, frankly, irresponsible speculation as to what was going to happen in social media circles mostly. That wasn't the reason we accelerated the timetable, but like Will said, there were a lot of components to it. You know, there was an unusual time for an NFL team to fire front office employees right as training camp was supposed to open. If you were going to make these changes, you would normally make them before draft, you know, sometime much earlier in the calendar year or in the course of the league season. So that triggered speculation. Like I said, some of it irresponsible. But we also had this component where there was other reporters involved in some of the incidents. So we knew that some of our competitors were aware of what was going on, or, you know, where our reporting was headed. So it was all we were getting close, but the pace then very much accelerated over those last 72 hours, and they were pretty hectic final 72 hours.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Reese, a current student. He says, with most of the employees working behind the scenes, how do you get to know them and start a relationship with them when you're not seeing them at practices and games?
I mean, that really wasn't a challenge for us, just because of the nature of the story. This wasn't, I mean, well, I should say, you know, we had, people knew Liz from covering the team for several years, and we'd reached out to a bunch of people 2 years ago. So it just wasn't the type of reporting where we needed to have seen these people in the last, you know, 5 or 6 months to, you know, get them on the phone and get questions answered.
Okay, I think from John, what is the most difficult obstacle you all have encountered when approaching such an open-ended investigation?
It's just getting people to talk to us. People are, as Liz said, people who work for that team are petrified of Dan Snyder. They're petrified of facing legal retribution from him, and also having their names associated with bad things that might happen to that team. So it's a continual daily battle to get people to talk to us.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
That really is the primary thing 2 years ago, this summer, going forward. And, you know, I think to step away a little bit, the fact that there is such a pervasive culture of fear says a good bit about the workplace. And that, you know, the new team president who has been brought in, Jason Wright, from what I've read of his description of how he wants to affect the team, you know, I get that doesn't seem to be the kind of workplace he wants to create. But, you know, there's a good, it's pretty sunk in, that fear among employees, even who've been gone a couple years. So, I mean, there are challenges of communication and you know, we're figuring out what is our priority, what is our threshold, you know, those kind of daily disagreements or debates. It's all part of healthy news discussions. You know, no one has all the wisdom. As much as I respect Matt Rennie and Will Hobson, you know, and my coworker Beth, you know, we've each weighed in, and we're not always on the same page. But you know, that's working through tough things. But the headline of that answer is exactly what Will said. You know, the challenge, getting people to talk with us, frankly.
And sometimes that's things that, you know, we know, you know, that we suspect are true, or that we've heard from people that we're trying to substantiate, or we've heard from one person but can't corroborate, or things like that, where, you know, how else could we confirm this information if it's true, or who else could tell us if this is not true, and this is a disgruntled employee or something like that. Like that's what you're always trying to corroborate information and find people who would be in position to know, who would be willing to talk about it. And you know, so normally our Zoom calls don't have quite as many squares, but those are the kinds of questions we're asking each other.
Yeah.
Great. Another question from a student. How do you go about approaching people with questions on such a difficult subject? Do you have any tips or advice for someone in that position?
Something I commonly do in these situations is that you handle with as much care as possible, but you also just try to make in a diplomatic way clear to a person that the value of telling their story, of telling what they experienced and putting that in the newspaper, is the possibility that prevents it from happening to somebody else. You know, I find that, you know, it's a self-serving explanation, but I believe it. I believe it to be true. And I do believe that people who, I know on these stories, that the people who have agreed to speak to us have almost unanimously have had no regrets about that decision.
Mm. That's well put. And I would only add, you know, there's, you know, no guile, no tricks, no gamesmanship. Just just be as completely honest and transparent about who you are, why we are working on this story, why we feel it has value, and try to listen to their concerns. And you know, there's not a shortcut or a gimmick or anything other than just as transparent as you can be. But I like the way we'll frame that because it is true. That's asking a lot of someone to speak about something that might be embarrassing or painful. Maybe their own parents don't know that this was said to them or done to them. So now we want you to tell the readership of the Washington Post, you know, that's going to take that person time to consider and reflect on, and give them that space and be there to listen as they work through that.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Michael. And Matt, I know you have spoke a little bit of it, but it's an interesting point. It says when they were a sports writer for more than 20 years. They said, I was struck in the days leading up to the original story on how much speculation about it was taking place on social media by other media members. What do you make of that, and did it have any impact on the reporting?
I can speak to this a little bit, and maybe the reporters would like to too. I mean, frankly, it was pretty disheartening, in my opinion. I don't want to cast the industry broadly to the actions of certain people, but it was pretty irresponsible behavior on those who did speculate on it. I would say if you're working in this kind of environment, and if you hear, you know, obviously they had heard that something was going on. Like I said, some of the speculation was just triggered by the actions of specifically, it really could, the wick really got lit when these first individuals were fired. With the timing was strange, and then, you know, people for whatever reason had got the impression that we were working on something, and it just led to a lot of really irresponsible speculation that was frankly unfair to everybody in the sort of, you know, mean, it was a nuisance for us, and it was something that we just had to tune out to the extent that we could. But really, you know, media people particularly, you can't, in a social media environment, you can't be, you know, all the people that are emboldened by anonymity, can't say much about those actions. But people that are members of the media should know better, and should know better than to speculate publicly on you know, public individuals and what might be coming. You know, if you want to try to compete on that story, go try to find out what's going on and try to report it yourself. But if you don't know, then just wait and see what happens. I mean, that was, I don't know, that was not like I said, it was a nuisance for us, and that's our problem, and but you know, we can deal with that. But for somebody that, you know, cares about this industry broadly and would like to see it act responsibly and be a beacon of truth rather than, you know, add to the noise that is so prevalent, that's not responsible behavior.
Liz,
Yeah, I guess I'll add and Matt said it very diplomatically. To me, it was one of the most upsetting, gutting, frustrating series of days in my career in journalism, to see just wild, scurrilous, baseless rumors explode like wildfire, under no apparent effort to do independent reporting or find out. Just each post kind of was trying to top the other post in a speculative manner about what the post was working on, what the post was reporting. And some people started throwing names of people. Oh, it's going to say this about that person, you know, putting out names of people who were never a focus of our story. So for me, I wanted to get on social media and respond, and my smart bosses said, do not engage, let the work speak for itself, focus on the work, which of course was the right thing to do. But real quickly, to a specific thing or two you asked there, it did not affect our timetable whatsoever. The story was going to run when the editors felt it was done. Just that mania did not slow it down or speed it up, nor did it alter in one bit the content of the story. There was, because the hype was so absurd, there were some people who were like, well, that wasn't what it was supposed to be. Well, you know, we were reporting what we were reporting. So we published the content we intended to publish all along at the timetable we intended to, but that was not a high watermark, the speculative days preceding it, for anything akin to journalism in my book.
thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Linda. Liz mentioned that the three journalists did not always agree. Could one of you say a bit more about the kind of issues on which you didn't totally agree on and how you resolved the disagreement?
I mean, I think it's mostly just stuff like, you know, order. It's you know, boring inside baseball stuff about like how we're framing a story.
Yes.
You know, we're all control freaks. We normally get to write everything and, you know, in the order and fashion that we prefer. And so you got a lot of cooks in the kitchen saying, here's what I think the story is, and here's how we should tell it. But we got, you know, a lot of very smart editors who are playing referee there and helping us sort everything out.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't overstate that. I mean, I've always loved newsrooms. That's part of why I hate this pandemic. I love what I call disagreements. It's just like different views about things. I could talk about word choice for like a whole seminar, you know, and so it can be that picayune, it can be that silly, or it could be, you know, who's the best person to call this source. It's just daily, and, you know, in other words, we don't move in lockstep. We talk things over, and I don't think anybody I don't think that's abnormal. That's good journalism. It takes a lot of brains to arrive at the best course, in my experience.
Yeah, all I would add to that is that, you know, all of these story, I mean, this story, the subsequent one, it would not have been what they, you know, it sounds like a cliche, but it's genuinely true that they would not have been what they were without the efforts of everybody that was involved with them, certainly from a reporting standpoint, but then, you know, the editing standpoint to what, you know, not just me, but my bosses, my colleagues, people, you know, all the way up with a story of this nature. So that's what's, you know, that we're really, really lucky to work at a place that has the resources that we can devote reporters for a long amount of time to dig into something like this, and they're not like also having to cover a city council meeting, you know, twice a week or something like that. Like, you know, I mean, we're really, really fortunate, and it's really unfortunate that there aren't more newsrooms with those kinds of resources these days. But that's what's great about it. That's the kind of work that can happen when you have a lot of people, really dedicated people, you know, taking different approaches and different mindsets toward with the same goal in mind. And we were really lucky to have that.
We're grateful to you for sharing the story behind the story. It's been a fascinating hour.
Well, thank you. It's nice for everybody to have joined us, and it's great to have this opportunity.
Yes, thanks. Thanks.
So I think Kate is going to rejoin us, and she has an announcement or two to make before we close out tonight.
Sure. Just thanks again to everybody for joining us. And if you enjoyed tonight, you should join us again for our next Povich Center panel, which will be on Tuesday, October 20th at 7 o'clock. We'll be discussing why Black coaches are underrepresented in college football and the National Football League and the efforts to change that with University of Maryland football coach Mike Loxley, American University law professor Jeremy Drew, and Cyrus Merry of the Fritz Pollard Alliance. So again, that's October 20th. That's another Tuesday at 7 o'clock. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a great night.
Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night.